I was hoping I could borrow the president's water, but I see say we're standing on existing protocols. And of course, when you are as vertically advantaged or disadvantaged as I am, you can understand why we need to stand on existing protocols. So Mr. President, former President Jonathan, President Obasanjo, the people from Nigeria, as you know, we have gained every right to be very supportive of everything that happens in Ghana. I was invited here, I've forgotten the year now, when the Ghanaians set up their own equivalent of Oputa panel or the Truth Commission. By then, your former president, Nana Akufo, was the Minister for Foreign Affairs. When I came, I made it very clear to the Ghanaians that I would be ready to answer the call from Ghana anytime for more than one reason. At least defeating the Black Stars was already a settled question. And of course, one player that I have difficulties forgiving is Thomas Partey, whose goal sent Nigeria out of Nigeria's hope of playing in the World Cup. But I support Thomas Partey because until recently he was a player of Arsenal. Anyway, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me get very seriously to the matters of the day, and thank you so very much. I have no idea why President Jonathan honored me with this call, and actually when I accepted the invitation, I didn't expect an audience as distinguished as this. But now that the bottle of water has been brought, I tell you, please don't take it from my speech. A young priest who was posted to a community where, drinking alcohol was literally a pastime. And the concern was how to stop these people from drinking very cheap alcohol, because they were always drunk in the morning, most time of the day. So a young medical doctor came to the parish and introduced himself to the parish priest, that he was a medical doctor. And the parish priest said, look, on Sunday, I will read the gospel, and instead of a sermon, I will sit down and you will speak to this congregation and find a way of giving them medical reasons why consuming alcohol is dangerous. Because I've tried everything to let them understand that drinking alcohol is not something God is happy with. But I haven't succeeded. So on Sunday, the medical doctor came to church, and after the reading of the gospel, the priest called on the medical doctor, who came, stood in front of the congregation, put out a table, 2 glasses, empty glasses, and then he took one glass, filled it up with a bottle of water, and took the other glass, filled it up with a bottle of a liquid that was the local gin that people were used to drinking. And then he brought out an earthworm and put the earthworm inside the bottle of water, and people were watching. They didn't know what it was all about, but they saw this earthworm wriggling in the water. And then he took out the earthworm and put it in the second bottle, and as it was wriggling, it died before it got to the bottom of the water. So the experiment was self-evident. But then, instead of the parish priest keeping quiet, he asked the congregation, now what do you think of this experiment? And obviously the man who was the chairman of the local alcohol drinking association looked at the priest and said, this experiment shows very clearly that the more alcohol you drink, the less chances you have of having hookworms in your stomach. You have chosen an intellectually stimulating theme in your Why Democracies Die. And it's very difficult for me to add to what the President of Ghana has already said and what most of the speakers here have had to say. My friend, Professor Julius Ihombere, who actually perhaps one of Africa's leading political scientists, should be standing here instead of the other side. But according to your letter of invitation, you said, among other things, and I quote, that you want to interrogate the structural and systemic drivers of democratic decline across Africa, rising authoritarianism, institutional fragility, shrinking civil space, and exploring new democratic systems. exploring how democratic systems are weakened and dismantled. But let me make some clarifications to express my concerns before I proceed with my comments. I assume that my keynote address is meant to merely paint a wide brush to some of the thematic issues that I know that more distinguished scholars will be able to deal with, because I believe that they will do most of the heavy lifting. One, because of their experience, and two, because many people have more than just a theoretical experience and understanding of democracy, but a very practical one based on the fact that they've seen this, they've done that, and of course, the first people on the line here can speak to those issues. And only last week, President Goodluck Jonathan himself, about whom I will speak at the end of my paper, but he made the point, which caught the attention of many newspapers in Nigeria, about the politics of treachery and the kind of people who also were close to him, but again, sooner than later, he realized that in this game, there are very few favors that people give. But this is not unexpected, because whereas in other professions, if you want to be a priest, you go to training, you want to be a mechanic, you want to be a barber, every other thing, you want to be a shoe shiner and other things, you have to go and learn. And in many cases, you have to be given a certificate. Politics is the only system that you don't need training and you don't need a certificate. And I think this is what makes politics more dangerous in Africa, because it is an all-commerce game. But I'm a bit worried about the pessimism that is implied in your choice of theme, which is when you say how democracies die. Of course, if you say how democracies die and you invite a bishop, maybe I'm expected to officiate the funeral rites of democracy. I make the point, and I will speak to the issue of if we say how democracies die, there is no laboratory yet for testing the efficacy of that claim. But of course, one might also make the point that, of course, there are variations in thematic perceptions, definition, and practice of democracy. And given the shades of contours and the landscape, the question we might need to ask is, which democracy are we really talking about? Because democracy, like music, has various genres of, more or less various themes, because jazz is not calypso, Ghanaian high life is not the same as Nigeria's juju music, hip-hop is not the same as pop, nor is it equal to reggae, funk is neither rock, nor is it jazz. Each of these musical genres elicits different emotional responses and talks to different audiences. Against this backdrop, we might pause and then ask the question, which democracy's death are we really forecasting? And is it the American type, is it the African type, is it the Asian variant, or is it claims that are made elsewhere? For example, the Chinese, many people think that the Chinese don't have a multi-party system. They do have a multi-party system, because the Communist Party is a party, but there are also other systems. But what is also very interesting is that the Chinese make a claim which is equivalent to what one of America's famous public intellectuals referred to as manufactured consent, because the Chinese have 8 registered political parties that are supposed to be in opposition, but they are bound never to be against the Communist Party. So yes, they exist. And you can claim that China practices multi-party democracy in the same way that we can say Uganda practices multi-party democracy, or Cameroon, or Rwanda. But in each and every one of these democracies that I've mentioned, you operationalize the concept of opposition at the risk of your life or at your own risk. So to be sure, Africa continues to wallow in a culture of self-deprecating, self-loathing, and self-flagellating lamentations, wondering when we shall ever catch up with the West. Using Western liberal democracy as our models will always leave us feeling that we're not like the Americans, and we're not like the British, and we're not like the Europeans, and therefore there must be something wrong with us. It is this patronizing self-righteousness that enabled President Obama to stand here in June 2012, and he said to the people of Ghana that Africa needs strong institutions, not strong men. Not unexpectedly, Obama received standing ovations, and yet no one bothered to ask President Obama whether there was a necessary contradiction between strong men and strong institutions, or whether weak men had ever built any institutions anywhere. Then as now, to me, President Obama's irritating pontification merely exploited the arrogant and condescending manner that Americans and Europeans have come to view Africa and its development. deliberately ignoring or sidestepping their complicated roles in the sabotaging of democracy across the world. For them, Africans still remain the white man's burden, and that somehow our underdevelopment is a character flaw. Ignoring the exploitative historical processes that have led them to where they are, we are often made to feel inferior and made to ignore the issues of those whose backs these so-called strong institutions were built in Europe and America. Perhaps this feeling that we are failing may have helped the organizers of this conference to frame this conference as a call to democracy's funeral rites. Am I therefore right to assume that the theme of this conference has been inspired by the book, How Democracies Die, authored by two American political scientists, Stephen Levinsky and Daniel Ziblatt? Although many Africans, as usual, found inspiration in these cynical views of democracy expressed in the book, many of our people tend to forget that this book is directly a liberal attack at the Trump presidency or America under President Trump. But it is not to deny that there are lessons for us. Rather, the issue is that African scholarship must find reasons to focus on Africa's historical and cultural histories, appreciating that even after 200 years of exploiting others, democracy in America and democracy in Europe and elsewhere is still largely a work in progress. In the course of our assessing progress within democracy, we cannot ignore the savagery, brutality, bloodshed that are now woven into the fabric of our legacies as countries and as a continent in relation to our past. Nor can we ignore the extent to which military rule arrested our march to democracy. Propelled by false narratives of missionary zeal to drive progress, the military marched into state houses across the continent of Africa. The president of Ghana has most eloquently choreographed a lot of that. And yet years of military brutality and bloodshed through endless coups and counter-coups across Africa helped to fracture our democratic ecosystem, destroying the very foundations of our cultures of human rights, free media, functional and effective bureaucracy, judiciary, legislative assemblies, and constitutions. Years of misrule resurrected and deepened ethnic consciousness as ethnic blocs sought to use military power and autocracy to institutionalize ethnic or regional hegemonies. Subsequently, in the 90s, after the so-called end of history, half-hearted plans to return our countries to the path of democracy were often marred by the blind ambitions of the military men and women themselves. Their autocracy, they mutated as autocratic dictators, pretending to be democrats, and in my view, debates about the duality of our democracy must therefore be measured against the backdrop of this convoluted view of history. With all its structural flaws, Africa's march to democracy is seemingly unstoppable. Africans know where they have come from. The future may be uncertain for them, but we have no hope of returning to the Egypt of autocracy and dictatorship that has been our lot. Our two countries, Nigeria and Ghana, remain the best examples. Our people are hungry, they are still poverty-stricken, they are living in destitution, yes. Our democracy has not delivered what it promised to them, yes. Democracy has not made them safe, yes. Democracy has not ended years of oppressive and suffocating corruption, yes. And yes, our people are still caught in the cusp of violence. However, our situation today is evident that our people have nailed their hopes for progress and development on the mask of democracy with all its flaws and very hostile, strong headwinds. It is historic for us in Nigeria that Nigeria has conducted 7 successive back-to-back elections since 1999 till date. These elections have been seriously flawed, they have been bloody, they have been chaotic, they have been below par. Yet, unlike a few years ago, neither the losers nor frustrated citizens of Nigeria have called the military to stage a coup, as it was, and it has always been the history of our country. Our people have now realized that military rule has proved itself to be a cure worse than the disease, and that the military itself has also realized the institutional damage it suffered from years of being in power. Therefore, the challenge now is for Africans of this generation to ensure that in our hands, the seeds of democracy are nurtured. Because of Nigeria, despite our troubles, despite our uncertainties. It has often been said that Nigeria, the unity of Nigeria is like a Catholic marriage. May not be happy that it doesn't break up. This discussion is timely and auspicious. However, your topic, How Democracies Die, should be replaced by a more hopeful title, How Democracies Can Survive. For indeed, who has ever seen the corpse of a dead democracy or even once a carcass? Our concerns, of course, should be on how to learn lessons about the consequences of democracy dying and seeking how to avoid what is happening across Africa. Any good driver seeing another car in the ditch after an accident would do well not to pity the car that is in the ditch, but to obey the rules of the road. And there is a saying in Hausa, for those of you who speak Hausa, but translated it says, if you see your brother's beard on fire, put water on your own. Africans must learn that democracy is hard work with no easy answers, not because Africans are not searching well, but because those easy answers are not found anywhere. Revitalizing the civic space by free speech, a free media, and a civil society that is alive to its challenges is the best strategy of keeping authoritarianism at bay and keeping people hopeful. Ahead of Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999, I published a book titled Democracy and Civil Society in Nigeria. And my conclusion in that book, then as now, was very simple, that democracy and autocracy cancel themselves out. One cannot exist if the other, both of them cannot coexist because one's existence defeats the existence of the other. This is neither the time nor the place to debate or define democracy. However, it is important to note that each democratic seed has had its own story of growth, harvest, or failure, depending on where and when it was sown, who nurtured it, on which soil, under what weather, and to what end. By way of definition, the world has come to accept Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech definition in 1863, that democracy is a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, as literally cast in stone. However, on further interrogation, there are gaps in democracy's definition and its operational claims. Once we shift gears to identify geographical locations, cultures, and perceptions of who the people are, and who defines who the people are. And I cannot improve on what President Obasanjo just said, because I told him the quote of what he said should stand side by side with Abraham Lincoln's claim. And what is also very interesting is that Abraham Lincoln delivered this speech in 1863, and it's the same 1963, much later, 100 years later, that Martin Luther King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. And you notice that even in that speech, which was delivered, if you are familiar with Washington, with the statue of Abraham Lincoln, so India, when Martin Luther King says 100 years ago, he was referring to the Gettysburg speech. But of course, he makes the point that 100 years later, all the promises that were made or conceptualized in that speech have never really been realized. And I think we can repeat the same thing, that there's always a distinction and a dissonance between the claims of politics and political rhetoric of when people are in campaign and the realities when governance takes off. We could, for example, ask what form of government we are talking about, since every government in the world, whether by ballot or by bullet, ostensibly hangs its toga of legitimacy on the claims that it is for the people. And all you have to do is to read the speeches of, let's say, Nigerian coup plotters from 1966 up till the last one in 1999. I sat down and read all of them. In fact, one of our journalists put them into a book, and it's very interesting. And you ask yourself, what were Nigerians thinking when these people were writing these speeches? In fact, some of the speeches are largely coherent only on one thing. One, the soldiers emphasized their redemptive capacity, but also, very interestingly, you could also see, in fact, there was one coup plotter. Happily, the coup didn't succeed, but the man promised that there was henceforth going to be, what do you call it? The country was going to be under, what is it? What is the word? Under curfew from dawn to dusk. He didn't know the difference between dusk to dawn. But we would, for example, ask what form of government we're talking about, because every government makes this lofty claim. No one has ever declared up front, either through a coup or through campaign, that his or her ambition in politics is to form a government of myself, for my family and my kinsmen. The Afrikaners in South Africa, the white supremacists in America, Hitler and his Nazis in Germany, Mussolini and his fascists in Italy, King Leopold who ruled Congo by proxy, all of these men and women through history made altruistic claims. Philosophies like communism, Bolshevism, Stalinism, fascism, Nazism were operational ideological vehicles that conveyed dreams and hopes. And of course, people were enticed, and these people had great followership. They set the clock of democracy back. However, democracy has proved its incredible capacity not to be crushed, because democracy still saw the backs of all of these people. So one of Africa's most distinguished scholars, the late Professor Claude Ake of blessed memory, once argued that the attempt to define democracy presents us with what he calls an anarchy, and attempts to clarify the definition of democracy only adds to the confusion. So by whatever definition, democracy in theory and in practice is about people's ability to participate in determining who governs and how they are governed. I often say that if you see a dead body, you can spread any kind of cloth you want, especially if the body is naked. But if a man is naked and you give him a cloth that he's not happy with, he will still throw it back at you. So fundamental to democracy is the essence that people, although it is flawed, that people have a say in who governs them. At the heart of all of this is that by whatever name we call it, humanity has continued to search for the best ways of ensuring how do we stay safe? How do we raise our families? How do we manage community relations? How do we address such themes as justice by whatever language, by whatever gender, by whatever ideology? What is justice? What is equity? What is fairness? What is humility? What is respect? These are the principles that undergird democracy. So we're constantly searching for these ideals, and democracy just happens to be, in my view, a scaffolding around which we can hang some of this. And as long as this human quest continues, it is impossible, therefore, for us to talk about democracy ever dying. Another name for political practice of these ideals over time, with patience and sacrifices, leads to the deepening of political culture. Because African democracy focuses only on elections. We don't pay much attention to what happens after the elections, but the consistent and persistent repetition of these processes leads to what political scientists refer to as political culture. And when something becomes culture, you don't think about it, you just do it. Respect for elders, if it's culture, you just do it. Nobody has to, prompt you. So for me, fundamental to how democracy grows and is appreciated is the need to develop a political culture. But of course, we accept, and we also know that systemic and consistent interruptions of this process by the military in Africa has created a sense of a culture of cynicism among our people. So if we are concerned about how democracies die, then like all dreams, we must accept that the causes are not the same. Because why X died is not the same with why B is alive. Therefore, when we speak of institutional fragility, shrinking spaces, the weakening and dismantling and weakening of democratic systems, do we see them as causes or consequences of the death of democracy? In other words, are we perhaps confusing the symptom with the disease? Particular diseases do not kill everyone. Not everybody who is suffering from cancer necessarily dies. Some people live longer. Not everybody people die of malaria. People die of all kinds of things. How do we explain the fact that the same sickness strikes one person, kills the person, but then other people are able? The medical people will tell you it depends on your immune capacity. Therefore, during the period of COVID, for example, the records seem to suggest, not necessarily, but at least that's what the doctors were saying, that most people who died during COVID had other underlying ailments, which COVID simply exploited. And I think we can therefore say the same thing about democracy, that its capacity and ability to survive depends on what are the underlying socio-economic, cultural conditions around which democracy is supposed to grow. In the last 20 or so years, the world has witnessed reversals and decline in many countries in Europe and America. We have witnessed the rise of what is now called illiberal democracies, sustained by right-wing hate groups. We are witnessing the rise of terrorism around the world. Although all of these pose severe threats to democracy, I would rather that we speak of the challenge to democracy rather than its death. In my view, as long as humans exist, there will always be democracy. If we see democracy from the point of view of its leaders, presidents, institutions, parliaments, senators, senate presidents, political associations, political parties, then we can contemplate its death, because all of these institutions are subject to human mortality. However, when we see democracy as part of the human instinct, thirst, hunger, and quest for love, for fairness, for integrity, for a sense of belonging, for community and family, then as long as these ideals exist and they sustain and define humanity, democracy cannot die. The democratic instinct and ethos is already embedded in our DNA. To be sure, politicians and political parties, parliaments, constitutions can be banned or destroyed, as we have seen with autocrats in uniform or out of uniform. But the human instincts that are supposed to nurture cannot die. We can therefore argue that certain types of structures for the pursuit of human happiness, security, and well-being could collapse in the hands of wicked men and women, but others will spring up. Democracies might die in form, just as food, arts, social habits differ among our peoples and countries, but the essence still remains the same. Now, you heard about Nigerians' jollof rice. Ghanaians are free to produce a poor copy, but still jollof rice. But when you know yourself that when you eat jollof rice in Ghana, when you eat jollof rice in Kenya, you know that they are just practicing. The problem of many African countries, but you might say jollof rice is jollof rice, but there are differentiations. The problem with many African countries is that they never really experience successful transitions. After colonial rule, and I think, again, my friend, Professor Ihonvere, has written extensively about this, that is the assumption that we have that we transited to democracy. No, transition from dictatorship is not logically transition to democracy. In part because, as we saw with successful transition, especially by the military, they still managed to embed within the system of transitions landmines that later on exploded to send us back to the bottom of the hill. So we went through rudimentary elections, but we never even developed a political culture. Africa transited from colonialism, military dictatorship, but did not successfully transit to democracy. The military often sowed many landmines. So when Western liberal democracies, which we have adopted across Africa, with their focus on free markets, when we neither have the freedom nor the markets, presupposes a capitalist economy when we don't have the capital, focusing on such concepts like transparency, accountability, a free media, human rights, a free judiciary, rule of law, and a lot of talk about fighting corruption. The elevation of these concepts does not address other fundamental cultural factors that blur the lines in many African cultural discourse. And there are many people here, I'm sure President Obasanjo will also sign on to that, that in many African languages, for example, Western liberal democracy insists that opposition is institutionalized as part of democracy. But for many African countries, we're struggling, we're thinking in English, but unable to speak in vernacular. Because what does really opposition mean? And of course, many people will argue that because opposition is read in the vernacular as somebody who is an enemy, that is why it is easy for the reflex of the African politician to want to either bump off anybody who poses himself as an opposition. But of course, the system itself is not attractive, because I served as a member of the Electoral Reform Committee in Nigeria. One of the things we saw was that you had cases where, for example, the dominant political party is such that everybody has to belong. And people who decided to vote differently, when they went back to their communities, the communities literally sent them back. They said, we don't want to be in opposition, because they know the consequences of being in opposition. So when we talk about this concept, it's important that we understand the cultural context in the African situation. The elevation of this concept does not address other fundamental issues. Anti-corruption waiting agencies, for example, sidestep the fact that corruption and other manifestations in African politics are often the symptom and not the disease. The Mo Ibrahim Index, for example, broadly measures the efficacy of democracy by such concepts like freedom, political participation, media, freedom, education, human rights, security, transparency, accountability, anti-corruption, sustainable development, among many others. And there is no doubt that democracy is in peril today, but it is not dead. Let us not become victims of what I call exaggerated pessimism. The story of the United States of America is a lesson. After over 200 years, the behavior of Donald Trump and his supporters on June 6, 2022 suggests that time and experience very often, are not reasons for us to go to sleep. Because the human instinct for violence doesn't ever go to sleep. Therefore, we must remain vigilant over the claims that democracy makes. And the point, therefore, is that no matter how long democracy has been in our country, it is the strength of the institution that sustains the occasional assault to this foundation. Now, of course, if you live in a country like Nigeria, Ghana, and many African countries, a culture of cynicism has been embedded, because if you talk to Nigeria, people tell you, are we going to eat democracy? If you tell them it's going to take a long time, they say, how long is long enough? Yet, history suggests very clearly that democracy and its quest has no shortcuts. The challenge for those who govern is to ensure, I often use the metaphor of, I think women call it the pacifier. This little plastic rubber that women put in the mouth of a child. The child is sucking the rubber. There is nothing inside the rubber. But at least it enables the mother to continue cooking without disturbance. So in a way, African politicians must give us some plastic rubber to continue to manage, between now and the next election. Democracy's womb possesses many seeds, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's not so much the quarrels that politicians engage in. In fact, many ordinary Nigerians, including myself, continue to encourage our people. Please, when you see these politicians fighting, even if they are throwing chairs among themselves in parliament, don't kill yourself, because they will still close the door and distribute the money of state among themselves. In that area, there is no fight. So very often, many of us jump into thinking that, these politicians don't like themselves. No, they like themselves. Even armed robbers have common interests. So let's measure our enthusiasm, because very often we think that democracy is about to fall because our people are always fighting. As a priest, I have experience of helping resolve problems of marriage. In the end, I've had family, women and men, come to me and say, look, our marriage is no longer working. We're 10 years now, 5 years now, we're sleeping in the same room, but we're not sleeping on the same bed. Or people will tell you all kinds of things, but families themselves have realized that marriage, the priesthood, every vocation is a work in progress. And that is not so much a question of the problems of the moment, but the development of the inherent capacity which you can glean from friends and culture and history, but also drawing inspiration from the moral basis of your relationship, that things can work differently. And when a man realizes very clearly that he took his wife for granted, or that the wife realizes she took certain things for granted, it is possible for people to go back, renew their commitment, and have a much stronger relationship. Similarly, flawed elections are not necessarily evidence that democracy is not working. Very often it is the over-enthusiasm, but also agents of state, electoral bodies, the police, and so on, that often confuse the president with the state. Very often in our countries, the military, the security agencies believe that they confuse the state with the president. And they think that their obligation and responsibility is not to the people of Nigeria or Ghana or Kenya, but it is protecting the regime that is in power. Rather than dying, democracy can lose its appeal and allure for very many reasons. But often the letter and the spirit of the Constitution are miles apart. Therefore, we must continue to make the point, that citizens' engagement with the institutions and instruments of state is fundamental to how democracy grows in our countries. Rather than believing that democracy is a game of experts and all we have to do is literally choose which club we are going to support. Being involved in democracy in your country is not the same as supporting Arsenal or supporting Liverpool or Manchester United. There are many of us who support any club that is holding a trophy. But it's much more than that. And the call is much deeper than that. And the sacrifice is much deeper than that. Because conceptually, we confuse office with power. Okay? There are people who are in office, but they are not in power. There are people who are in power, but they are not in office. And you can often see a lot of that from the fact that if you ask Nigerians, maybe who was your governor 20 years ago, average citizen will scratch because they can't remember. So it's about impact, but it's also about understanding that we are not just agents to be acted upon. Politicians must demonstrate the spirit of patriotism A deliberate effort must be made by politicians to understand that their lives must reflect both the letter and the spirit of the claims of the Constitution. In this way, politics will not become a do-or-die affair, a ticket to the theater of corruption. Institutions like the judiciary, electoral bodies must inspire confidence among our people. I now want to try and end. The debate about democracy remains controversial, but it's also enchanting. It will continue to remain a subject of intense interest. Democracy is about systems, and systems will always remain in a state of flux because the goalposts of human expectation are constantly shifting. An American professor of political science called Kostika Bradatan published a very beautiful article. You can find it on the internet. But he titles the article, "Democracy is for the Gods." Because he's saying that the claims that democracy makes, humanly speaking, are literally unrealizable. But it's not an act of frustration. And there's a little book I just started reading last week. The title is The Shortest History of Democracy. And in it, John Keane, the author, says, and I quote, "Democracy remains the most potent weapon yet invented by humans for preventing malicious abuse of power. A system that aspires the dreams of how to prevent the few and the rich and the powerful who act as if they are mighty immortals that are born to rule." End of quote. John Keane further argues that actually, contrary to what we claim, democracy did not start in Athens. Because he makes the point, hundreds of years before the Athenians began using assemblies, the Syrians, the Phoenicians, the Indians were also gathering, but their system was not as framed as what happened we're basically the same with what happened in Athens. Now, of course, Amartya Sen wrote a very beautiful book. The title of the book is The Argumentative Indian. And he makes the point. It's a direct frontal assault at the claims of Western civilization. And Amartya Sen said, look, we as Indians, we are always arguing for 10, 20 hours so don't give us the impression that we are supposed to learn any of these things from. So it speaks to the need for us in our democracy to also deal with practical issues of what are the cultural surroundings around which we make our claims. I wish to conclude by arguing that contrary to the notion of democracy dying, we should focus on addressing the usage of the various models for the achievement of the goals of human development. Democracy is a subject, and it is subject to toxicity, it is subject to decay, to rot, to fracture, but not to death. Democracy will never die. There will be bad elections. But the only cure to a bad election is another election. Often, those who pose the greatest threat to democracy are the elected officials who often, as one of our Nigerian politicians, a friend of mine who died just about last month, Mr. Audu Ogbe, who once said that, he said to me, Nigerian politicians believe that people vote for us to enjoy on their behalf. So the assumption that politicians have that the rest of us who voted for you are so stupid and that all we are supposed to do is to stand and look at you in your beautiful cars, your beautiful houses, and we are all just spectators. All we can choose is which team are we going to clap for. Participatory democracy means participating in elections, but also participating in reaping, the outcome. So I therefore want to end by saying, first of all, it's a great honor, President Jonathan, for me to be here. When you took that decision on March 31st, 2015, he's written a little book, which you should read, My Transition Hours. But when you took that decision, it was one of those moments that it was between yourself, your conscience, your God, against the run of play. On the 31st of March 2015, even before the elections had concluded, when you made that call, you were answering what to me was more or less a divine call. And by taking that decision, not only did you reverse, and I think your successor made the point himself over and over. You had all the military, you had all the paraphernalia of power around you. It would have been possible to instigate a war. But by taking that decision, in my view, the people of Athens entrusted into your hands a touch of hope, a touch of what democracy should look like. The honor, the dignity, the sense of sacrifice That is what democracy is all about. You illustrated that. And it's the reason why when you call, I will come. When you knock, I will open the door. Because right now, I had to excuse myself from a meeting of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Nigeria, which is still on. Our meeting is finishing actually on Sunday. But I had to excuse myself to be here because I thought it was a great honor for me, to be with you. But please, General Theophilus Danjuma, one of our greatest statesmen, President Obasanjo's colleague, once said, very often, the voice of the devil is not so far from the voice of God. Listen very carefully to those who want to use you as an instrument for the elongation of their interests, and not your interests or the interests of Nigeria. Think very clearly, pray very clearly. Final decision, it's your call. Finally, some years back, John Major, a former British Prime Minister, addressed top-level politicians in the UK. And he started his speech by posing a question. He said, if after 850 years of our democracy in the United Kingdom, if there is one person in this room that believes that we have gotten it right, please raise your hand. After 850 years, if there's anybody who believes that we in the United Kingdom have succeeded in our democracy, please raise your hand. Of course, no hand went up. Therefore, and I want to end by saying something about what is now catching flame, the hopes, the expectation, the hysteria around our young generation called Gen Z. Being young is a transition. But transition to adulthood and responsibility. Very often, many young people in Africa don't have the experience that people of our generation had. Many of us have the past that we grew up with. Because many young people today are born in Accra, born in Nigeria, but brought up in the United Kingdom or other places, and the children of the elite. Therefore, their expectations are pretty high. And they also, this is a culture of fast food. Democracy cannot be served as a fast food menu. Taking responsibility to govern is not the same as wanting or aspiring to participate in the meal of corruption. Because very often many young people in Africa, many groups that feel disadvantaged, rather than focusing on the real things, what do we need to do? What kind of discipline do we need to put in place? Because if you want to be president tomorrow, governor next tomorrow, we should see the signs today. There is a saying among the beggars in northern Nigeria, who are the Muslim beggars, that if Friday is going to be good, that is based on the gifts I will be given, I will see it on Wednesday. So if you want to be president of Nigeria or Ghana or your country, begin to study the mistakes that those who came from behind have made. Begin to understand the history, how this struggle has come through. It is no use to pretend that simply just knowing how to kick a football means that you can play like Messi. It's not going to be so. I remember I used to watch Ronaldinho when he was a young man. But Ronaldinho said sometime when he was being interviewed, he said, look, my brother and I, we used to spend 8 hours just practicing. So when you see Ronaldinho do the things he does with the ball, it's not because the ball is in his feet. So, I make the point. Tolstoy once said, all unhappy families are unhappy differently. The reason why democracies have failed somewhere may not be the same with the reasons why democracies have failed in our own situation. But democracy has survived through tough times and has suffered afflictions. Democracy has survived cancers. It has survived demagogues, mobsters, empires, emperors, narcissism, apartheid, and other forms of evil. But as long as there are brave men and women like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Steve Biko, Václav Havel, Aung San Suu Kyi, the young Chinese boy whom we saw in 1990 when at Tiananmen Square, many of you can Google and see him. A tank was coming before him and he had only a cellophane bag. The tank was going this way, he was going to say, come and crush me. As long as the human imagination that has inspired people like Steve Biko, Mahatma Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, Malala, and thousands of other young people across the world, as long as that spirit is still in us, democracy will not die. The winds may blow, its flames will never go out, and all of us, you and I, are custodians of that flame. Thank you very much, and may God bless you.
I think we can do better than that, please. Let's indeed give our keynote speaker a